Rasheed Ogunlaru, coach, speaker, and author of Soul Trader, Putting the Heart Back into Your Business. I am delighted to be here for the latest in my new Mastering Your Craft series. Mastering Your Craft is a series of talks actually inspired by some articles that I'm writing for a publication, which is all about how you can master your craft as a coach or work in the field of NLP. And ironically, my guest today is an expert when it comes to consulting and coaching businesses and large organizations that are growing. So I'm delighted to introduce you to my guest today, who's Julio Graham. Julio, a very warm welcome to you.
Hello, Rasheed. Thank you very much for interviewing me today.
Yeah, I'm really so excited about you being a guest because actually you are one of the most recent people that I've met, one of the most recent good people, very gifted people that I've met. We met at an event. It was actually the formal launch for a charity run by a very, very good contact of mine. That again, you're supporting that particular charity with your expertise, and somebody I respect a great deal. And we got chatting very, very briefly at that event. And then we had a conversation following up, and that follow-up conversation, what struck me was that you're the kind of person with a lot of insights and expertise to share. And with this series, Julio, what I really wanted to do was really explore for anybody who's watching these, for anybody for whom is on that journey to master their craft, in whatever that means to them. They might be a healer, they might be a therapist, they might be a coach, they might be a consultant, they might be a professional, they might be an athlete, they might well be a leader, they might be a chief executive, anyone who's interested in mastering their craft. And I guess what's really interesting about you, your background, and it says here, you know, Julio Graham is a business consultant, business coach, who's worked with international organizations all over the world for the past 25 years with experience in a range of industries, from information technology through to business structure and processes to business forensics. I know that you've worked with the likes of Deloitte. I know you work independently. You've worked with all sorts of organizations, NHS, smaller businesses, bigger businesses here in the UK, overseas. You're originally from South Africa. You've worked globally. So I'm very, very glad that you're here, because no doubt you're the kind of person that people call in when all of a sudden there's a problem. And
absolutely. And I think the thing, firstly, I think the mastering your craft in terms of consulting, it's been an amazing journey, because for the last 20 plus years or whatever, I've been a consultant in different guises, I must tell you. Often you're a consultant, but you're not a consultant. You're a teacher, or you're a learner. You tend to learn a lot often too. So the real challenge, I think, in mastering anyone's craft is that you've got to learn along the way. And I think learning along the way, really, there's a lot of stuff that you've got to deal with. So the first thing that I think anyone should think about dealing with is paradox. And paradox is one of those things that we hear it. It's one of those, we call them in the consulting world, we call these things suitcase words. You sort of have to unpack them before you know what's going on. But, you know, the paradox really that comes with mastering your craft is that whilst you become an expert really quickly in your field, and you can be a very specialized expert, or you could be quite a generalist but still be an expert in a particular field. The problem is you run into different problems all the time, and the problems come from a variety of different places, and these conflicts, and often you sit with sort of two conflicting thoughts in your mind. And the trick is to be comfortable with that, to be able to sit there and say, well, yes, I understand that the client wants the cheapest possible solution, but they also want the best solution. So how do you know, there's a bit of paradox in that. It's a bit like, you know, the situation we have with war. Nobody wants to kill other people, but you don't see everyone protesting every day in the street because there's a war on somewhere. I mean, some people do. I know I'm generalizing, but those are paradox. You know, we tend to live with them quite easily, but when it comes to sort of your own craft, you have to be doing what you do well, but at the same time you have to be learning. And it's very difficult sometimes, because the clients actually, they push you.
It's a really interesting paradox, isn't it, Julia? Because I'm just thinking, and I just sat there listening to you, and I like that moment where toward the end, where you're talking about, on the one hand, being an expert, and on the other hand, at the same time, having to learn, having to develop. And I would imagine that's often, I would imagine, the dilemma that organizations that call somebody like yourself in the way they're experts in what they do, but perhaps the world is changing, or they've got changing needs, and or their clients, their customers have changing needs, or the economy, or whatever, the technology is changing. And so on the one hand, they're experts. On the other hand, they're new to whatever it is going around that they're faced with, or it's a new problem, or it's a new blend of challenges that they're faced with. So I would imagine in your field, it's a really interesting paradox, this one of mastery. It's really interesting that you're going in there and people looking to you as an expert, and they've got all these challenges at the same time. So you're at the cold face of all of this stuff, trying to work things out and to coming up with the best solutions, as you say, often where there's this paradox also of doing things the best way, but most cost-effective way.
Exactly, and if I can try and share my screen and show you just a slide, which I think will give you an idea of all the complexity. The thing about complexity, and this is the other thing we all deal with. The thing about complexity, everyone says keep it simple. I tell you what, when you find a simple solution, it's because someone has understood complexity. So I want to show you this slide, and I'll just talk you through this slide. Let me just see if I can find. Yeah, it's this slide here. So what this slide is talking about, so we were talking about being an expert at something, right?
Yes.
Are you still seeing me? You're seeing the slide?
Yeah, I can see the slide, and I'm going to stop talking, and as long as you carry on talking, then people will be able to see the slide.
All right, perfect. So essentially, if we have a look on the left-hand side there, I've got an arrow pointing up, and it says there, the client's required capacity for direction setting and learning. And at the bottom, on the bottom axis, says degree of active involvement by the client. Now, if the client doesn't require a lot of direction setting, or doesn't have capacity for direction setting and learning, and they really don't want to be involved, then it's just a matter of telling them what to do. And so there's nothing wrong with any of these phases or directions here. But this is the kind of business that I do, and it's the way people learn. So sometimes you need to be told, listen, do this. This is how you fill in your tax form. There's no other way. There's no maybe if. This is how you fill it in. If you do it incorrectly, the tax man will come and get you. Then if you move a step further, you sort of want to be slightly more, want the client more involved, you may have to go and sell a solution. So often what happens here, and this is sort of more of a traditional bricks and mortar type consulting, they would have a whole bunch of clever solutions to things, to problems that people have. And they'll go out there and they'll say to people, do you have this problem? We have this particular solution. And they sell their solution to people. And as time has gone past, people have started saying, well, actually, you've got to find out what exactly it is the market wants. So companies like Microsoft have gone out and they put out a version of Word, for example, and then it's not a really complete. There's some bugs, there's some things that are different, and they test constantly with the customer. What do they want? What do they want? And they change their product, and so they evolve their product with a customer. And then the second last one that you see is the consulting. Now, consulting really means you've got an idea of what the problem is, you've got an idea of what the solution is, but you really need your client to sort of get engaged with you so that you can find a solution. Mm-hmm. You're not so much co-creating, because you see the co-creating is this one. The co-creation one really is the ultimate, and that's where the coaching really comes in. So consulting, I would put co-creation is closer to consulting. Co-creation is closer to coaching than it is to consulting, because co-creation really means a client approach you says, look, I've got a problem or I've got a situation. Can we try and resolve this problem, or find a solution, or find something to do that will make this problem or the situation better? And what happens there is that as the consultant or the coach, you come in with a set of models possibly, or a set of worldviews, or a whole multitude of things, and you help the client create a solution. So you're co-creating that solution. And the interesting thing is, if you take, for example, NHS in this country, mm-hmm. A lot of the NHS stuff, there's a lot of telling going on. You go to the doctor, they tell you this is wrong, and you antibiotics, etc. However, if you go to the top end of that scale in terms of co-creation, you could also go to the doctor. They talk to you about your knee and say, oh, you need a knee operation. Now, that's a telling. Mm-hmm. They might even do a bit of selling on you, say, well, if you have a knee op, X, Y, Z. The other side of that would be for them to say, well, actually, your options are the following. You can go for therapy for a year and a half or 2.5 years before you have a knee op. You might not need a knee op. And that's more like co-creating. So I don't know if that makes a lot of sense. But
it's really interesting on a number of levels, you know, Julio. So I want to kind of come back and kind of and talk through that. So I wonder if you could put that back up for us just for a second, and just again, just say a word as you put that up.
All right. So there is the types of services that I offer, or the variety of them, and how and what mode I'm in when I'm offering them to a client.
Right. So what interested me about that model that you presented us with, Julio, there's a couple of things that really struck me. One is that that's an example of expertise. You know, there was a model there, and it's taking us through the different kind of stages of which a client might need to be involved in something, depending on their willingness to be involved or their ability to get involved, and depending what the scenario is. What that highlighted is you understanding a whole range of circumstances well enough, and having developed or found or been schooled in models that will help you on your journey and so on. What was then also interesting about that for me was that when you then, the example that you gave, when you were talking us through the lovely example, how, for example, on the first step, there was this thing about telling, you know, very often people will go to their doctor, not always, and this is this, and this is basically what's going to happen, and so on, that telling. And then you pointed to the co-creating right at the top. And what was interesting about that, and I know you've done some work in the NHS as I have, and I'm very mindful that in parts of the NHS, again, there's a recognition as an organisation that many people with various health challenges, when they feel as though they're just passive in that whole process, there can be all sorts of problems, and they highlight particular problems. And now there's all that kind of things around partnership, and again, co-creating, you know, and patient-led, partner-led, service user-led, and so on, involving people. So what struck me about that is that there's learnings throughout that whole curve for individuals that, you know, that one little model that you presented there, there's things in it that are relevant to a consultant looking at this, and they're tuning into this talk because they're thinking, oh yeah, I'm a coach, I'm a consultant, I'm wanting to get better at what I'm doing. So there's something about this talk that's spoken to me, but also some of the themes that you drew out, of course, highlight your particular expertise, and they highlight things that are themes that could be important for somebody to, or valuable for somebody to understand if they're an organization, or for example, if they're a manager. I can look at that and think, you know, there are things I recognize how as a manager managing. So there's lots of stuff that slide that you threw up, that you put up there, Julia, that points us into this conversation that we're having that could go in so many different myriad of ways. I think what I want to ask you first is, how on earth did you personally, maybe we'll come back to this slide later, how did you find yourself in this world of business consultancy, which I guess is around business improvement for often large organizations, and I know you also work with entrepreneurs and smaller organizations. So how did you possibly find yourself in this field where from day one people expected to be an expert?
Well, it was, you know, I don't think I ever, when I was at school, I don't think I ever said, well, I want to be a consultant. It definitely wasn't anything like that. I think originally I wanted to be a doctor, actually, but I'm very squeamish, so that wouldn't have worked out either way. What I found was I was lucky enough to sort of grow up when IT was a very new thing in the world. So IT was this black box that no one understood. And I suddenly realized that I had a propensity to understand IT, and it wasn't as geeky as what people made it out to be. Turns out it actually is as geeky. At the time, I didn't think it was. So I made some effort and I started learning about IT. And it's a weird entry point into consulting, you would say. But what happened was then the business people would come to the IT people and say, we need X, Y, and Z. We want to do this, we want to do that. And suddenly I had to learn what the business people needed, because it's all fair and well to go and say to someone, please computerize our systems. The problem was that a lot of the systems that people had, the paper-based systems, etc., they were so poor that if we computerized them, we would just have a bigger mess much quicker. So a lot of the times people thought computerization was the answer to their problems, because that, you know.
For a moment, Julio, because you said something that's very powerful, and that for me, that strikes me as perhaps our first step here to recognize, or it's a very strong theme. that you had this interest in technology. And you highlighted you there relatively early days where lots of people didn't understand it, etc. And then you described these situations that because you were an IT person, that businesses would recognize that they had a problem, that perhaps IT could help them solve it. So the word that straight away jumped into my mind is expertise. So what I observe here is that you found yourself because of things that you're interested in, and then you would have done whatever study you did in them, and then you had expertise. So I mean, I'm just wondering, our conversation, I'd imagine today, is going to be going on several levels at the same time, which often mastery does require. So hopefully our listeners will bear with us for that. But then I think the first theme I therefore want to present back to you is this theme of expertise, because of course I think that I'm so glad that you mentioned that, or that what you said drew that to my attention, because of course if you hadn't early on in your journey had something that you were skilled at and that you had insight into, it would be very difficult for, I would imagine, for much of the rest of it in your career to have unfolded. So I just want to ask you if you've got any thoughts about that, and are you aware that expertise or insight or both, is something that you have had from early on and throughout your career that has meant that you've been able to do the things that you've done?
I think, Rasheed, the answer is yes. I'm aware now. At the time, I definitely wasn't aware. So at the time, young, out of school, did a bit of studies, started playing with computers, found I liked them a lot, and then suddenly found that actually I understood business very well because of the way people were explaining, how to explain things. I really had to go down to sort of finer details. And
where did that come from? I want you to go back into the story because it's fascinating. So you recognized that computers, you were good with them and so on, you understood how they worked, and then you just added, and you could understand business. Where did those propensities come from?
Well, absolutely. It was an interesting break. I had a couple of interesting breaks, I suppose, in my life. At the time, I didn't like breaks. I felt like a lot of hard work. When you look back at these things, of course, hindsight is fantastic. So if there were a few things. I managed to land a good job in the banking industry as a research and development person. I think mainly because at the time they didn't know what a research and development person should be. I think that's why I got the job. And so
How old were you at the time?
I must have been about 21. Because remember, coming from South Africa, we also had to do military service and all those sort of things. So it was, it was tough times in many ways. We had a society that was busy transforming itself to become a better society, and everyone was on the make. So everybody. I mean, South Africans will tell you that late 80s and the early 90s, everybody was on the make. You were either sanction busting or apartheid busting or both. It was really very exciting times in South Africa. So the result is a lot of opportunities would arise just from people and from job adverts, etc. I knew someone who worked for the bank, and I said, "Why don't you come in for an interview? I think there's a really difficult." As a matter of fact, the guy said to me, "There's a really difficult guy there, and he needs a research assistant." So I went in, had this interview. They then got this guy in, and he gave me a hard time. For whatever reason, he liked me. So he said, "Sure, employ him." So I got this job as an R&D person. And so that allowed me to mess around with technology. But I had to ask questions about the banking people and say, well, could you use this? Or what about this? Or how are you doing this? In those days, ATMs were brand spanking new. I mean, online banking hadn't been invented yet or any of this sort of stuff. We were just starting to learn how to use PCs to connect to mainframes and things like that. So there was a lot of experimentation and a lot of learning going on. And so I had to develop these skills of interviewing people and asking them, what do you need? What do you want? What about this? What about that? All those sort of things, and try and help them find solutions to problems that some of them didn't even know they had these problems. And during this time, so that was my first break, was that I got this freedom to mess with technology, and I had access to all the key stakeholders in a bank. So that was very good for me. And during this time, someone I'd met earlier in my life approached me and said to me, look, I'm doing all of this real estate stuff. I need you to come and help me with technology in the real estate. So I left the bank and went and helped this guy in real estate. And there we wrote one of the first sales systems for a real estate business. And suddenly I was an expert in sales systems for real estate. And it wasn't just the computer side of it. It was the process flow, etc. So suddenly all of these things that are just, you think they're mundane, that, I go to work and I do X, Y, Z. It doesn't matter what you do. The moment you start doing that enough and you can start improving what you do, you start becoming an expert. Because the moment you can improve something, that saying that they say, if you keep doing the same thing and expect a different result, then that's sort of defined as insanity. Well, it's the same in business and in consulting for me. I did things, the results weren't always ideal. So I went back and looked at it and said, well, what if we did it differently? And so, that process of learning.
Right. So, Julio, that's really, really powerful what you were just sharing there. And I'm just gently kind of reflecting on it and pick up some of those themes that our viewers can consider along this thing about mastering one's craft. So one of the things that jumped out for me from hearing your story was that on the one hand, you showed us earlier on a diagram, and there were two axes. And it's interesting, as you were talking, I could see another kind of diagram emerging. On the one side, you had, there was IT, and on the other side was business. And I thought, oh, this is interesting, and these fundamentals of your career. Would you say that's accurate? I mean, and are there any other dimensions for you? Because if I stop and think about it, of course, and I can think about a friend of mine who's much younger than I am, and they're passionate about, and they were studying at university now, IT and business. And it's interesting that they've been combined. I guess in the past, they might be separate. But of course, in the world that we live in today, business and IT and technology and so on, you cannot separate them. And in fact, many businesses over the period of time that you've been talking about, particularly in the last 15 years, have been, whether they like it or not, often dragged kicking and screaming in terms of those industries online and so on to embrace technology, including one of my old fields in terms of music that learn those lessons quite late. In many ways, the record companies and so on. So Julio, I'm curious to know, in terms of your expertise, can you tell us what are those things that underpin it? I'm hearing, it's IT, an interest in technology, and it's an interest in business. Are there any other ingredients to it?
Absolutely. So at the risk of sounding like a consultant with a matrix for every situation, there's a third dimension in the stuff that I do, and that's people. And that was, for me, that dimension didn't emerge until much later in my career. I always did the telling and the selling. And when you're telling and selling, you're not really getting feedback. You're doing a lot of convincing. So you're going and you're saying, I'm the expert. I know what problem you have, and I know what the solution is. The sort of the silver bullet solution. And so if someone had an accounting problem, we'd say, well, there's a system that will resolve all your GARP problems, or all your legal problems, or your legislation for real estate problems, or whatever your problems may have been. This will make your...
For a second, because I think there's a very important theme here. So again, going back to your diagram that you presented us before, which was on this sliding scale between telling, selling, etc., through up to co-creating. As you said, yes, that, I'm seeing, of course, so many businesses fit within that model, or experts, isn't it? To tell, essentially to tell. And do you, just a very, very quick point, do you often observe in many businesses where perhaps they're not sophisticated? Now, of course, there'll be some times where people, perhaps they want something where the type of expertise they engage with is a tell, or they want something to tell them. But has your observation been that often the evolution hasn't happened for that business, or for that individual, that consultant, that coach, or whatever, to become sophisticated enough to go up that chain? Because sooner or later, some people at least are going to need the different approaches, not just the telling.
Well, it's exactly. So I think there are two issues there. The first one is this issue of commissioning. So how do I get work? So often people have a problem and they think they know what the solution is, but they're looking for an expert to implement the solution. Mm-hmm. So that's someone is out there actively commissioning someone to come and tell them or sell them a solution, right? And the problem, and that's generally how consulting, people say, we need a governance expert to implement a governance framework, for example. Mm-hmm. Often, though, that's not the problem. And this is this paradox thing that I was talking about earlier, that my life is full of these things. So I have to go to client, and in my proposal to them, or if I get lucky enough to be able to have a conversation with them beforehand, in my proposal, I have to kind of hint at the fact that the problem that they're trying to solve might not be the correct problem. I'll give you a quick one. In the lean thinking world, they talk about the 5 whys. So a little story about the chap who walking in the factory and he sees oil on the floor, and he knows he's got to ask the 5 whys. So he says, why is there oil on the floor, to the nearest person there? And the chap who's standing there at the machine says, because John didn't mop up the floor. So you've got to ask 5 whys. So his next why is, well, why didn't John mop up the floor? So the guy says, well, because John is on vacation and there's no one else to mop up the floor when John's not here. So he says, well, why is there no one else to mop up the floor? Says, the guy, look, I don't know. I don't work for HR. So the manager says, not a problem. I'll go to HR. So he goes to HR and he says to HR, why is there not a man to mop up the floor when this other man is on vacation? And the guy says, well, we've had a bit of budget constraints, and so we can't always have a replacement. So the guy says, well, why are we cutting budgets here? Why aren't we cutting budget somewhere else? And the guy goes down and solves an HR problem, right? So he then goes and commissions, and he gets someone to say, please help us cut costs somewhere else because we've got this HR thing problem. That's one solution, but is it the right solution? I mean, the other way it could have been was, why is there stuff on the floor? The guy said, because John didn't mop it up. The guy could have just looked around and said, why is this pipe leaking? And we could have gone down another set of whys and an engineering solution to get a different type of oil or different seal or gasket or whatever. So often people go down their own set of whys and think, okay, this is the root cause. But sometimes we just have to step them back, walk them back a bit, test their assumptions. And, you do this as human beings all the time. I'm walking down the street and from a pub spills a whole bunch of loud football hooligan type sounding people. And I'm being gentle about this because, you know the feeling. It's 2:30 in the morning and a whole bunch of loud people in the street. I cross the road. And why do I cross the road? I've just inferred a whole bunch of things. I've inferred that these people are not good for me. I've inferred they're going to do harm to me. I've inferred all sorts of things. They could be anything else. So the thing is, you've got to come down from all these assumptions that you've made. You've got to come down, and it's the same as a consultant. You've got to walk people backwards just a few steps and say, are you sure you're looking at the right problem? Have you thought about all the right things to solve your problems?
Well, that what you just said there was very powerful. I love that story about the person and there's oil on the floor and the 5 assumptions of 5 whys. Absolutely fascinating, and I love the way that you highlight how there could be so many different spin-offs of elements in there from why did we, different gasket, different type of oil, blah blah blah, and so on. What that brought very powerfully to me then again home is the skill and the expertise that over time you've had to develop in your management consultancy, business consulting, coaching career. And I'm interested in how it's evolved. I know in our pre-conversation you highlighted that the career has kind of evolved. So Julio, I want to kind of ask, for example, that's, that scenario scoping, was that example that you're giving was one of the things that you were taught when you were when you were studying. And then I'm also curious about this element that you flagged up, which was the third element. You said, well, yes, there's been the IT in my background, yes, there's the interest in business, and then the thing is people. So I'm wanting to discover where you learned that, and whether some of it was just a, you know, book technical learning, and then when was the bit that Julio really understood that very deeply? Because the way you talked us through it, I could tell energetically that's something that you know. And the way that you told that, and all the different directions you could have gone off in there, you know, I could almost see the mind working, all the different rooms of expertise in your mind. So I know I've given you quite a loaded question, but I know you've got the sophistication, the skill to kind of unpick it, or perhaps point again where we might be wanting to point, and not in the assumptions of where it is that, because I love that bit too.
Absolutely. I think for me, the big aha moment, and it was a long aha moment, but it was a big aha moment, is in 2000, I was forced to go and do an MBA. Now that sounds crazy. Well, you know, first of all, why wouldn't you want to do one? And if you can, and secondly, what do you mean you were forced? Well, I was working for at the time, and they were restructuring and doing all sorts of things, and they said, look, if you want to get anywhere in this business, you're really good at what you do, but if you want to get anywhere in the business, you need credentials, mate. You need to go and get yourself an MBA. And literally everyone around me had MBAs, and some of them had doctorates and all sorts. I mean, they're a bunch of smart people. So I thought, well, you know, I've got to go and find an MBA. But I mean, I was, that was a while ago, but even in those days, I was quite an old guy to be going to get an MBA. You know, most people do their first degree and get their MBA. By the time they're 27, they're busy on their PhD or doing their expert job. And so at the ripe old age of 36 or whatever it was, I went out and I found this MBA. I mean, they called it an executive MBA. It really was just an MBA, but for all the people, you know. So they called it executive MBA to make it attractive, and add a few zeros to the price, I think, was what they also did. But I mean, that's not the point. The point is, I went into this MBA with a view of getting the letters MBA behind my name. You know, Masters of Business Administration, and then just strutting my stuff. And this MBA changed my life. It literally changed my life. I went in there, and it was all based on systems thinking. Mm-hmm. And systems thinking has been around for a long time. You know, it has been around for a long time, since the 50s and things like that. There are all these guys that have been doing this sort of stuff. And systems thinking, really, it absolutely changed my world. And that's where the focus on people also started becoming quite relevant, because with systems thinking, you view things as a system. So I'm not talking about IT systems. I'm talking about systems. So if you think about the traffic that's moving around, that's a system. The trains, that's a system. A dinner conversation is a very complex system. And so when you start viewing the world as systems, you've got to take into account all the things that happen in a system. And humans are one of the big things that happen in a system. They're one of the most unpredictable things. And the other thing about systems, of course, that is quite real, is that systems try and move to a state of balance. They're constantly trying to stay balanced. They don't like being unbalanced. So if you've got a balanced system that's not working well, and you try and change it, my old style of consulting, where I came and told them what to do, you know, sort of come and say, this is what we're doing, and you sort of force a solution down the barrel, that the system just pushes back. So often, before I did this, often I would have failures, and I wouldn't understand why there were these failures, why a certain part of the business didn't get it, or I never got that. And so it was just, you know, I used to believe, oh, it's a numbers thing. You know, you can win 80% of the stuff and 20% and you're not going to win.
Right.
But then, of course,
so many things you've said there, Julio. I want to just pause you there, because you've said so many powerful things, and in a way, I didn't want to pause you there, because there's so many rich things that you were saying. But I think, again, for the sake of this conversation, and for some of our viewers and listeners, and our unpicking of this thing around mastering your craft, there were a couple of things again there that struck me. There was this point in your career, established though you were, things that you were doing with somebody, and somebody highlighted you, well, hey, look, you know, for your further credentials further down, you know, you really need this MBA, and others were blah, 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 blah. So there's that thing around that expertise and that skill set, and the qualification, that classic qualification, which is part of that, and then acknowledgements and all the rest of it that were layered onto those qualifications and the authority and all of that kind of stuff there. And then what was interesting that then emerged from that, so from that skills and tools side, then you brought in then what you learned there and what you became your eyes opened into systems thinking. And then you suddenly drew to our attention how everything it is driven by a system, that the systems, or if you look at so many things, you will see systems there, be it transport, be it the human being as a system, etc., which is fascinating. And I then love that last point that you were just saying at the end there, that before you would really grasp that, first of all, you're working just on the telling side, and then you advance to here, and then you're making this really intriguing point how when things didn't happen, you put it down to like the 80 notion of the 80-20 rule, that okay, maybe this isn't I haven't been able to convince this particular bit of business, but this systems thinking opened up a whole another richer layer of understanding things. Now, I would imagine that this therefore takes us to the core, I would imagine, of mastery in a field like your field, where if I can understand it from the bits I know from the other conversations that we've had, there have been times where you go to big organizations. And actually, so I don't know how big the organization we're talking about, the diamond-related organization was, the size of them, and so on, but where you're dealing with big organizations, presumably quite complex organization, lots of different moving parts, and therefore to be able to understand all of that stuff that's going on. And then the other element you highlighted in there, I love the element where you talked about, and then then you've got people, and people are one of the most complex things, or rather you said most unpredictable things in the system. So can I just ask, first of all, in terms of you in mastering your craft, is it really this space in terms of systems and structure? And I know that we're planning to do a whole series of talks to explore some of this kind of stuff. Is that really where the meat of all of this stuff is for you as an expert, and in this, for you as it relates to mastering your craft? But what I'm getting a sense of from you, Julio, is that, look, in order for one to really master one's craft in the kind of work that I do, the level of consultancy that I've done in my career, one needs to understand systems. You need to understand how various systems work, what the threads are, what the themes are, etc., because if you don't, you're not going to be able to spot it. But going back to our story of the oil on the thingy, because your assumptions might be wrong, and you may set off one thing here, and then you set off another problem, you set off another problem there. Am I right in that?
Yes and no. I think that we mustn't get too hung up about the systems thinking side of things. I think what is really good about systems thinking is a particular way of looking at the world. Mm-hmm. And if it works for you, and it clearly works very well for me, then adopt it. If it doesn't work for you, then find your way of viewing the world that works well for you. Now, within systems thinking, there's a million different types of models and all sorts of things that you can use. So I think that the concept of systems thinking is more like a philosophical underpinning, if you want. I don't want to call it that, really. It's not really a philosophy, but it's just a way of thinking. And some people take to it very naturally, and others just don't get it. So it's not about getting hung up about that. It's about the fact that we've all got different worldviews. And if you can look at the world through a couple of those, you suddenly see a different world. And if it's useful to your business, because I mean, this is about business, isn't it? If it's useful to your business to look at it from a scenario planning perspective, or from a Stafford beer, or whichever perspective you want to look at it from, if it's useful, then use it. If it's not useful, then why? This is the thing about change for the sake of change. We don't want change for the sake of change. It's the same with leaders, and this kind of comes to answering your second part of that question, which is the people thing. We hear about the 1,000-day manager, and we see this short-term view of quarterly reports that people and the company's profit share goes up and down, and then it's the same with the football. Ultimately, they kick out the coach because the team's had a bad day. And the same that happens with leaders in business too. The guy, bad profits, or bad, something bad happens, politicians, and they kick the guy out. The new person comes in, and there's this general feeling. We always used to say, new broom sweeps clean. And the more I think about a new broom sweeping clean, it's terrible, because we lose all that knowledge. All the mistakes we've made, we're going to have to make again if we do with this analogy of the new broom sweeping clean. When it comes to business,
can I pause you there again, Julia, because again, you, as always, given us so many rich things to consider, really rich things to consider. I like that moment when, after the question I asked her, around, am I right with this and that? And then you said, well, yes and no. And this is, I've been picking up on the theme that you've presented for us to look at around systems thinking. And she said, look, well, in a way it's just underpinning. It's sort of one way, if it's useful to look at it that way, and let's face it, these things are relating to somebody understanding their business, and that's useful. But you said it could be very useful to have one or two ways or a number of ways to look at things. And what's interesting about that, what struck me from that, for myself and in my work, I thought, oh, this is interesting. I couldn't agree with you more. Often when I'm with a client, I need to help them explore how they see the world, and crucially then how other people see the world. And very often, when we've had conversations around this, I'll explore different metaphors of them or of their teams, because I need to get them all onto the same page, so that then we can relate to the world that they're actually in. So there's a lot of time spent in around this metaphor to help them understand how they see things and perceive them, which gives us a perspective, and then looking at, and often it's just through trying different things just to help get clarity. Sometimes it's just through exploring. And what I liked about what then you went on to say, so there's this thing about the systems, and then this other theme which you highlighted to us, and I'm sure we'll come back to a little bit more, also this theme about people. What I liked about what you did there was that often one of the challenges that can happen, of course, is that when there is a problem or a difficulty, somebody will come in with a new process. This is how we're going to do it. Now, the problem of that, it assumes that everybody can work to that kind of process, that particular way of doing things. And we see this in a set process or whatever. You might, again, you go, for example, from it might be an organization or a football team. It's going to be like this. And then when you add into it the additional element that you then flagged up. So one, that thing, we've got to be so careful when we say, okay, it's going to be like this. But the other thing that struck me there was that when you went into this thing about new broom sweeps clean, or when there's change and we don't harness the expertise that there is there, or have a collaborative approach. Because unless you understand how people see the world, you're never going to get them, and you can work with that, and you can help them feel more comfortable in that. Change is never going to happen. I'd imagine that this must be one of the huge challenges all the time with organizational change and restructure and all of this kind of stuff. You must see this time and time again. So even a well-intentioned change to bring in changes and so on, if it's not done mindfully, and if people aren't carried along with them, the system, even if it's the best system, people aren't going to let it work, or it won't work for them. And so that's what, for me, what I'm hearing is implied by those themes that you brought to our attention, which is where this stuff gets very, very serious and important.
Exactly. The big thing, if you remember the little graph that I gave, so you've got the telling and the setting, and you sort of, there's steps that you're moving up. Because as you move up, your capacity is increasing, your capacity to learn is increasing. So if you've got a great capacity to learn, and you've got a great capacity to participate, people feel more included in things. So when you're co-creating a solution, it's our solution. It's not the consultant's solution, because the consultant's solution is very easy to blame him when things go wrong. Our solution, people tend to work a little hard at. Now, most people want our solution. They don't want the solution or a solution. And I think that's where the people bit really comes in. And you're absolutely 100% right. Change and managing that change. It's not just about having a change program in place. It's about actually understanding what are the problems, what are the objections, what are the challenges. There are some solutions. There are some sort of situations in which there are no solutions. You take a lot of conflict and you talk about sort of the conflicts that we see in the world today, where people have two different underlying philosophies or religions or whatever their underlying belief systems are. If they are completely opposing belief systems, there are very few places where you'll find common ground. Now, I don't think anything in the world is that opposite, that there's no common ground. There will be some common ground, but you can only co-create around the common ground. Now, if you're a consultant, or as I like to call myself these days, a coach, because I find that I'm having help customers learn more than what I am. So customers are demanding that you co-create with them because they feel that's better value for money than just telling them, and then they need you again and again and again. So in a sense, once again, this paradox, a good consultant is one who works himself out of a job, is what I always tell people. And some people get it, and other people go, but why would you want to do that? Well, it's not whether you want to do it. You have to do it. In order to remain good, you have to do it, because if you don't, the customers will go elsewhere. And part of that, and I'll introduce another concept, I'm sorry that I keep doing that, but part of that is organizations are becoming slightly maturer. And I don't mean in terms of their age or anything like that. I mean in terms of how they learn and how they deal with knowledge. A lot of knowledge is being embedded in organizations. And when knowledge is embedded in an organization, you've got to respect that knowledge, and you've got to work with that knowledge. And if there's something fundamentally wrong with that knowledge, you've got to go and fix that, rather than trying to, as I, come with a new script and try and enforce that on. Because all that's going to happen is people will go, well, new script doesn't tie up with our old script. There's no path between the two, so we ignore the new script. And that's the challenge with humans. We are quite capable of making associations that have got no sense, that make no sense. If I said to you, whenever I show you this blue stripe, you have to tell me it's red. You can do that, absolutely, because you're a human. It's as a matter of fact, it's just, what a silly example, but a computer can't do that. Or I can make it as complex. I can say on a Tuesday and a Thursday when you see blue, and carry on. And so what happens is we add meaning to things, and so this whole idea of them and us, with the consultants coming in, and us as the business, they're trying to change management and the workers, and there's all of these. We polarize ourselves because somewhere in the back of our minds we want to belong to a clan, and so we've got these little groups of people, and it's us and them. And when you're working in that environment, which is what business is all about, it's either about the different levels within a manufacturing plant, or engineering doesn't talk to R&D, or advertising is, the sales guys are selling what we're not making. You hear all of these problems, and that's because each little system, that they don't have an underlying understanding, because no one's co-created the underlying understanding for them.
Really interesting, Julio. That was so interesting, and there were many important themes, threads there that you were talking about. And I just kind of almost want to pause there and just kind of consider that. And what comes through to me from what you said there is actually, what I get a sense of is, over your journey, if I kind of reflect on what you said there and the things that you've walked us and talked through, and some of these themes that you've highlighted to us, what I get a sense of is that over your journey, you've understood and learned a great deal about the landscape of business. You've learned a great deal about the ecosystems, and the differing ecosystems and the various different bits of the landscape. And I love this lovely theme that you bring to our attention around the common ground. And I love the bit when you point that if we can't find the common ground, let's just take then the example that you gave within an organization, an understanding of what is it that we're commonly trying to do, or what have you. Without that, it can't happen. Just as in the same way you gave the example of globally, we really don't need to look very far around the world to see where those kind of problems, all the different ways in which those problems exist. And again, it's true, isn't it? Because most people can think about organizations that they've worked, and where this team can't get on with that team, or this character, this member of staff, they're at war with this member of staff, or what have you, or two leaders, and so on. So what I get a sense of that's really interesting from what you're saying is, and then I love this, but then I also love this theme that I think that you're putting this thing around co-creation, and I just think it's really interesting, because I think that what I'm saying here is that it's almost as though that you've learned more and more about the science of what you do, but then, and again, it almost sounds like a cliche, but then the art around it is the stuff to do with the people, and I guess being able to engage with the people and having conversations that might spark them so that co-creation can happen, or that the beginning of the conversation can happen as a consultant, or that they seem to get that you get them. I get the feeling that that's the bit that's been added, Julia, that you've been the kind of person who's gathered lots of tools and insights because you've been fascinated by this stuff. But then you also realize that, hey, that's not enough. The understanding of the human beings kind of stuff and some of those themes and how some of those things that are not, that's why I love the example that you gave. Well, tell me if this is red or when it's blue or what have you, that comes into it, because you realize that without a grasp of that, and that it's, again, very, very difficult to make those things happen. Can you tell us a little bit about that people side then, and how you've added that to your work and to mastering your craft?
Yes. So the root of this really comes around how other people view the world. So which I'm just talking about people now. So if some people are visual people, other people are audio people, etc., etc. Some people are very logical, numbers-driven people, and other people are very emotional, if you like. I'm probably using all the wrong terminologies, but there are all these different ways or modes of operating. Mm-hmm. So what happens when you've got these different modes of operating? If you come along and you are a visual person and you put up a bunch of pictures for people to look at, and they happen to be a bunch of accountants who absolutely get the accounts but not understand what yellow fluffy clouds are all about.
I see this all the time in my work. I'm so glad you're bringing up this example, Julio, because I see this all the time. I mean, I just want to interject there because it's so important. This week I've got to write, or rather, well, I've already got a number of variations of leadership courses, but creating one for a particular organization, pulling these things together. And a large bit of it is around how people, different people's learning preferences, they're different, as you say, whether they're audio, they're this, and it's fascinating that you give the example of, and the example that you give is such a good one. You get the person who, and some of these things, of course, are stereotypes, of course, but nonetheless, it can happen. You get the person who's very visual, and they're going in to talk to the head of finance, and they give them all this picture stuff. The head of finance, they're going to give the person just purely, it's just all text, or it's all in tables and so on. And neither person understands what, and everybody's confused, and both people are in their own bunkers of how they see the world.
Exactly. Now, the thing about co-creation, so we get back to co-creation in humans. Co-creation is something, people talk about a meeting of the minds. And I've come to believe that there's no such thing. There's absolutely no such thing as the meeting of the minds. And that's just a belief of mine. So I thought we can debate it, but it's just a belief. But that's if you're trying to meet with your mind here. If my mind and your mind are trying to meet in our heads, there's no meeting of the minds. But the moment I take what's in my mind and make it explicit, so I write it down, or I put a picture on the wall, or I do a sculpture, or I write some music, the moment it just becomes explicit and the other person can interact with it, then we have...
Right, now we're talking. I want to, in that spirit of what you're saying, I just want to add something here, and it looks as though our computer may have frozen for a moment, but I'm hoping not. Oh, good, because you can hear me. I love that point that you said, and I love that bit that you said also about the meeting of the minds. And I would tend to agree with you. I mean, and many people who watch these things will know my particular take. But my version of what you've just said there, Julio, is that people talk all the time about winning people's hearts and minds. What most people are talking about is trying to win is their minds. Good luck. Because this person believes this person believes that, this person's been conditioned or whatever to believe. People see those things through that particular lens. But as you say, if I'm really wanting to understand, that will mean, I step back, the other person steps back, and then we can look and explore and so on. Suddenly, if there's that willingness, and that's the common ground you talk about, some of that willingness and thinking, and then suddenly a dance, all sorts can happen. But if I'm purely coming out in mind, the other person's coming out in mind. So I'll often say to people, the only way, and this is my take on it, the only way that can be done is that very often, a lot of the time, my take is in some cases, I will have to completely bypass, first of all, bypass somebody's mind to the heart, to connect with them at heart. And then I will bring to their attention how the mind works. Because, and that for me is, and it's interesting, it's good that we get to this part in the conversation, because for me, in my field, or the nature of how much work emerges for me, that was one of the things that I had to learn in terms of on this road to mastering. I needed to understand, not in academic terms, I needed to understand in real terms with working with people. What were those kind of barriers? And of course, mindset and all this, you know, is largely that. And, you know, their assumptions and projections that person has about the world. And of course, there are so many magical things in there. But I so agree with you. But then when there could be this space of common ground, empathy and so on, and there's so many, you know, this is where linguistics becomes very interesting, then magic can happen. So what I like about where you're pointing us to is this other space, because what I'm hearing from you now, and I wonder if this takes us into the co-creating space, is that this scenario that somebody comes to you with, or this organization comes to you with, is their perception of how the world is, how their business is. Many other people may agree with that perception, but it is a perception. It is a perception of how that person sees the world. Now, what can happen sometimes that then when there's a dialogue is that sometimes that perception is looked at afresh and they think, well, we've said it's an orange, but actually, no, it's a mango. Actually, it's more like a tangerine, or it's something we're saying it's a problem. Actually, is it a problem, or is this just a hump in the road? I thought it was bumpy for a minute, but no, it's just a thingy in the road. So what I love about what you're saying is that it provides a space where all sorts of possibilities can happen, including that there's just, you know, going back to your picture of the person who walks past and there's some oil on their thingy, that somebody comes along and just cleans it, looks up, sees if there's any other related thingy, and if there isn't, that's fine, because sometimes these things that nobody can explain will happen without there needing to be an inquest of all those different layers. So I love what you've just brought to our attention there, Julio. So I just want to hand back the baton over to you for anything else you want to just bring to our attention.
I think what you're saying is very important. This idea of having a common understanding, let's call it, or when I work with these things, I've got this thing, I call them artifacts, but essentially we produce things in business, produce business plans, we produce visions, missions, all these things. And the thing that makes the difference between a successful business plan or process or anything that we do, meeting, is if we have a common understanding about what it is we're trying to do. So that's why co-creation is so important. Because
right. Let me just pause you there, because what you said is so important here. And I want to ask it emphatically, because you're the expert in this field. So let's just restate it. That this thing about this common ground, common purpose, whatever, is so important that even we can have the best business, we can have the strategy, we can have the business plan, we can have the processes, but unless there is that, there is going to be problems. People aren't going to read, or people aren't even going to pick up or read the strategy. People aren't going to follow through on the policy. They're not going to, police or whatever the policy. They're not going to have the dialogue. There's not going to be the communication. That on one level, so you can have the best on all those levels: the vision, the strategy, the action plan, the processes, the procedures, and all of this stuff. It can all come tumbling down. Is that what? That's what I'm hearing from you.
Absolutely. The thing is, a lot of the times, the traditional consulting, and I must say consultancies have moved from that, but there are still some that do that. The traditional consulting said, we have got best practice, and they come with a whole load of stuff and they stick it in your business, and they work really hard to improve things for 3 months, and everyone works really hard, and then the consultants leave and everything goes back to the way it was, because there's no one there to drive that process, because it wasn't a common process. Sorry, let me just turn it down because it's going to keep making noise. There wasn't a common understanding, let's call it. It wasn't co-created. You can't just enforce something upon a whole bunch of people and then leave it unattended and go. It works in the military. because there's a certain discipline. In the military, people expect to be given orders, and they are expected to follow orders. But even that is a common understanding. So the underlying thing of the orders that they are given, which they may or may not agree with, the underlying common understanding is that they will execute orders. And it's the same in business. The common understanding that we have, unless you co-created with the people, and it's not always possible. That's the problem. So that you sort of revert back down, and you've got to go and do a bit of selling and a bit of consulting and maybe a bit of thing at times. Absolutely. But you're 100% right in saying is that if you can co-create everything that you're doing with all the parties that are meant to be there, then you have a better chance.
Inspired by what you said, because I know you're Brit, and I'm not quite as good at these things as clever graphs, but inspired by what you said, I've just done this now. I don't know if you can see this. Now it says people, purpose, and in the middle bit here, this is going to be process. And I tell you what, this is just my thought around what you're saying. What we do know, we're in a world full of people. It's people that the organizations and so on. It's people that the business is there to serve and so on. And there's going to be people who are going to need to carry out in between, at least at some level, even if you've got machines and everything else. So there's people. Now, in between here, we've got to have the processes, the procedures, and all of that kind of the structures and all the rest of it, which this represents. And then there's the purpose. And what I thought when you were speaking, that we start here, we're mindful of people and the different drivers and how they see the world. Then we need to step here. Well, why are we doing that? It might be the 5 whys and other whys and blah, 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 blah. And then in your co-creation, we can explore what's already here, and we can explore how this could be designed, and hopefully we can do that really in a co-design way. That's what I get a sense of. I get a powerful sense of what you said.
Absolutely, Rasheed. If you take that your diagram, you've got people on the one side and you've got purpose on the other side, and for every single person you have, they all have their own purpose, and they may all belong to an organization, and it has its own purpose. So the importance of that little bit in the center there is, what models are you going to use? How are you going to bring together all those purposes so that they're all going in the same direction? How are you going to bring together the people so that they all understand that their purpose is being fulfilled in a larger purpose also? And at the same time, how are you going to make money whilst you're doing all of this? It's all fair and well saying we all have this wonderful purpose, but there's no money to pay for the purpose. I mean, that's the other thing that often people...
Powerful. I want to, as we move to the end of this conversation, I'm looking forward to our series of talks that perhaps we might tell people a little bit about at the end. I say tell them a little because they're going to be partly organic, there'll be some structures, but just as we've explored here. The stuff that you've shared with us today, Julio, I think has been very, very powerful and very, very insightful. And I think one of the reasons why I was very clear and very keen to interview you is that I knew, and I guess it's part of the expertise that I've gathered over a period of time, I know when I meet people or I chat to people when they've got something of rich insight and value to add. And so I was very, 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 very keen to interview you here, especially as part of this Mastering Your Craft process. So I think I want to, before we close, to explore 2 themes quickly, if I can, with you, for us to perhaps some thoughts that you might want to offer. I think one, is sets of thoughts are for the person who is the coach, the consultant, let's say the person who's going into your field, who is wanting to master their craft. And then I want to come back to and perhaps finish with the lessons for organizations that you began to point to very much there. And in our co-creation, as we began to explore the people and the process, and I love that thing you said, for each person, there's all those different purposes, and how do we, I couldn't agree with you more. And I love that extra degree of dimension that you drew out of that, and that 3-dimensional kind of picture. So I think that first of all, let's deal with the first one first. That individual, like a younger you, they know that they've got these interests and this thing, and they're wanting to make it as a coach consultant. Well, as we know, many people have also been in these organizations, and they're growing their career as a consultant, and it's tough. And I know from my sole trader work, my book Sole Trader and all the rest of it, and being a business coach to small businesses and so on, And I think I want us to mainly concern ourselves with the thing about that's going to make them really a master of their craft. Of course, there's going to be business skills they're going to need to develop around that. But I want to just, as broadly as you like, can you give us some pointers, some tips to that person who is wanting to master their craft and I guess then be successful in what they do?
Absolutely. I think the key to mastering any craft is to be able to learn. So in other words, you need to understand how you learn, and you need to understand what it is you need to learn. So I'm not just talking about going and learning the hard part. So you know, the skills, but how to do PowerPoint or any of that stuff. And it's not just about that. It's the constant learning. It's about sort of reflecting at the end of a day, a week, or a project, and saying to yourself, what could we have done better? What worked? What didn't work? You know, it's all of that stuff. If someone had told me 20 plus years ago, keep a business journal on a day-to-day basis, I think I would have learned a lot more lessons a lot quicker than I did. Because in some sense, you know, you touch the plate that's hot and you burn yourself the first time. It doesn't mean you're not necessarily going to touch that plate again, because if you didn't recall that it was the plate you touched that you burnt yourself, you may very well burn yourself again tomorrow. Whereas if you sit down and think, actually, the reason I burnt myself today is because I touched that particular plate that happened to be on. That way, you're filling yourself, you're giving yourself a better chance for next time. So that is the one thing. I mean, you know, people talk about hard work and people say, oh, don't work hard, work smart. I think it's a combination of the two. If something doesn't work, change it. Don't be afraid to experiment, but don't just experiment willy-nilly, and don't experiment at your client's sort of cost, if you like. Make sure that if you are going to experiment, that you know why, and that you look at the results and go, well, that worked, or well, that didn't work, so we're not going to do that again. And also understand your context. I mean, all of this stuff is contextual. You know, when you're starting off in business, there's a lot of reasons why you're starting off. A lot of people start businesses because they have to. It's a way of making a living. For some people, it's their passion. So depending on what your context is, you may have to do different things. You may not have the luxury of time to reflect, etc., etc. So it's a difficult question to answer. But I think
you answered. Well, I think that you began to answer that so richly, and I think there's so much in that, isn't it? And I like the way that you said, you know, pretty much for anything that you learn, you know, and that learning bit, and that and not just learning the skills bit, but absolutely that absorbing understanding and all of that stuff around it. It's like the person when we hear it, often it becomes quite clear, isn't it? Or it's a nice metaphor, that when we hear how, let's say, great athletes or entertainers have learned, you'll hear the stories all the time, and they'll say, oh yeah, Michael Jackson, he studied them all, he was studying James Brown, this person, that person, Fred Astaire, this person, watching every single thing, wanting to know how that worked. Or again, the sports person who's studying, watching this, watching that, constantly learning, knowing one's learning, experimenting. I love the bit you also used to, and also not experimenting at the client's cost for somebody, I guess, who's in the field of it, being a consultant and so on. I guess is there something also, in the spirit of co-creating, I think there's something there, and I was interviewing somebody else earlier on today for another series of interviews, but what I get a sense of from you, Julio, is that there's real passion for the learning, but really the passion for what you're doing, which means that therefore is the passion around the enjoyment of the learning and the fine-tuning. I get the feeling that you have such a joy for the sport of what you do, that therefore that brings that aptitude and that hunger and to learn, to fine-tune, to grow, to have more things to be able to do. That comes hand in hand with that. That's what I get a sense of.
Yes, I think there are two parts to that too. Over time, I've managed. It's not all sunshine and roses, you know. I mean, the passion comes through because some of the stuff's very exciting. And for example, this interview, you know, I can explore a lot of different things and themes with you. But sometimes I am at a client and they just want the silver bullet, and so I have to bite the bullet for one. You know, I'm really mixing my cliches here, but and you just got to in there and do what you have to do. So sometimes you need a good mix of creativity and systems. So when your creativity is not needed or is failing you, fall back on your systems so that your systems will then be able to make space for you to be creative again at another stage.
Yeah, I couldn't agree with that more. Let's then, before we close then, the big question, which I'm sure some of our other talks will begin to address. And we're at a time whereby, for all we've learned, it's interesting, and it's quite interesting. So given this talk is around mastery, for all we've learned, and let's face it, there's a lot, there are halls, there are libraries full of books on management consulting, organizational development, this systems, processes, you name it. But many of our organizations have got deep problems. Deep problems, challenges. People think, I was watching the news today and things about particular organizations that went bust, and there's questions from governance to due diligence to this, to structures, to people, what about the pensions, what about the thingy, and why did the business fail? On every single level. And these are businesses often run by accomplished business owners. Let's put any of those particular things in a way, the specific stories to one side. But I'm really interested in any observations that you might have, and I think this is deliberately a big question, for forward-looking organizations. Because my assertion would be, if an organization is not prepared to look presently and to look forward and to look afresh, the chances are that you're going to stumble onto existing problems, or you're not going to have the appetite or the willingness to look for. So let's say for forward-looking organizations, given many of these challenges and the fact that we're in a fast-paced world, Julian, you must see this a lot of the time, and you've seen it throughout the course of your career. Complex problems, you worked in places like, instead of the NHS, you've worked in places like Deloitte, people call in places like Deloitte, so all of these kind of challenges. So you see this all the time through to budding entrepreneurs, budding businesses, and you have an interest in technology. What's your observations about, well, can you give us any pointers, therefore, for the organization that really is wanting to master this? And I guess, and I'm going to throw something in the mix here for you to either pick up or throw away. I think that I kind of almost want to have a go at answering this question kind of first. So forgive me, but then I want to kind of hand it over to you with your expertise, which I really want to hear. I think that what I want to say here is that if you are running an organization, you need to ask yourself some very, very deep questions. Why am I doing this? What's this organization here for? Why am I doing this? I need to be very clear why I'm in this. Because am I in the right risk, and therefore am I the best person? Am I really committed to going through on this particular process? Am I going to just completely delude myself? Do I genuinely care in my heart about this organization, about this climate, about the country that I'm serving, whatever it is, this football team I'm heading up, whatever it is? Ask yourself those questions deeply, powerfully, and profoundly, honestly, authentically. What is this organization about? What is this football club about? Because if I'm running a football club, that should inform me about what my role is. That thing that I'm trying to create will give me lots of information. Who is this for? Who the fans, etc., etc., etc. So sorry about that little rant, but I wanted to, and what's my greater purpose here on this planet and the people that I'm serving? I couldn't help but throw in my own Rasheedism about that. But I'm interested in this additional, that's me, we're having this, our joke around this, our magician and mechanic talk. So I want to hear from the mechanic who understands the magic, who has got an understanding of some of this magic that's involved. What are the things that you would say to an organization, a business that is wanting to move forward and it is wanting to succeed in whatever the word succeed means? Anything, I know framework's a very, very big question.
No, it's a good challenge. I think what you've just pointed out, the soul, to use your words, the soul of business is absolutely, you need to have soul to be able to do business. So your rant, I think, was fairly justified. But on the mechanic side of that, so the soul is the magic. If you're doing it for all the right reasons there, you then have to get stuck into the how. How do we do this stuff? And a lot of the stuff, and I'm going to quote a guy by the name of Ashby. He said that we require there's a thing called requisite variety. Now, also, once again, suitcase words from consultants. But what that means is that in order for you to respond to the world, you need to be able to be in every single state that the world is responding to you. Now, clearly that's impossible for an organization, even for us as humans. But the more variety you have, so as an organization, the more you understand the different states that your environment may be in, the more ready you are for whatever state comes your way.
I like that a lot. I like that.
Absolutely. And that to me, that is the thing. So in order to understand, in order to have who can respond to a particular state of the environment, you need to know what states the environment is in. And this is your business environment, your political, whatever environment it might be. So just in that little sentence, requisite variety, there is a lot of finding out, learning, skilling yourself up, maybes, ifs, buts. But that is what we have to do. You constantly, if you want to use metaphors, if you want to say business is war, well, you've got to be ready for wherever the enemy comes from, whenever. But business isn't war, so that's fine. But it's requisite variety. That is. If you do not, if I can only respond to people who have an accounting problem specific to, say, QuickBooks. Well, if some guy comes to me with an SAP problem, I can't help him. The same with a business. Somebody comes to you or I and says, my business is in financial, we've got cash flow problems. Now, if I don't know what cash flow is, how do I respond to the person? So just like I need to know about a whole bunch of things. And this is, it almost goes, I'm not saying specialize in all the things. I'm saying just open your focus a little bit and have a look at what else is coming your way. Because if you can anticipate those and you can skill up on this side of on the internal side and skill up for that, when that hits you, hey, you might not do the best job at the time, but at least you're dealing with it. It hasn't passed you by. And I think that's what happens with a lot of organizations is people get very happy with their success. They get very happy with the way they're doing things, and the environment changes. And then suddenly they find themselves in an environment that's completely alien to what they're used to. So you were saying earlier about the music industry. When Apple started selling music, I mean, what's a computer company doing selling music? That must have changed the music industry tremendously. And people talk about these quantum leaps and paradigm shifts and all these funny things. Those things are only perceived as that because the people who their variety was only in one particular direction. They didn't have this variety everywhere else. And if they had more variety, they would have maybe anticipated these things earlier. So that's a big thing for me. If you were to, what's the best advice you can give anybody in any business, that is keep your eyes open and look at your environment. And if your environment is changing, that's going to affect you in a bad way, then mitigate the risk. And if the environment is changing that's going to affect you in a good way, take advantage of it, because often people miss opportunity too. It's not just about mitigating risk and going, oh, be careful, be careful, be careful. It's about taking advantage. Risk there's two paths to risk. There's avoid the bad stuff, but there's also take advantage of the good stuff.
Wow. Julio,
so that's really,
that was such a wonderful, that closing sequence was wonderful because it spoke to both the individual, the consultant, and anybody at any point in businesses and businesses overall. Which is why I knew you would be a perfect guest for our Mastering Your Craft series. So I want to first of all thank you so much for being a guest here. And for just a couple of things, a couple of bits of housekeeping. For people who are watching this and thinking that's fascinating, they're looking for a management consultant and their businesses, we're going through all of those things that you described. What's the best way for people to track you down, Julio?
The best way is just to go to my website, juliograham.com. So Juliograham.com. And all my contact details on there. There's phone numbers, email addresses, whatever your mode of communication is, you'll be able to find it there. And you can also explore some of the things that I do and don't. That's probably the fastest way. I'm very good at email. Phone calls they're sketchy. It depends. Sometimes we're on a train or we're at a client, in a boardroom or in a cellar somewhere. So they don't always work.
Absolutely. Wonderful. And I know that this will be just one of our conversations, because a set of talks that we're having a separate conversation about, which I'm very, very excited about. And if they're anything like this one, then I'm in for a treat. I think that known viewers and so on. So I hope if you're watching this, I hope that you got as much richness out of this talk that I did. And Jim, just to say thank you so much. I think the work that you're doing is fantastic. And I think that, and I say that, I have a saying, just one last thing to offer back to you. And it ties in, I think, with our Mastering Your Craft series, which is this. My take on something is, if somebody's really good at what they're doing, I don't need to see the florist do, there with the plants. I don't need to see the chocolatier whilst he's making the chocolate. I don't need to see the painter paint. I don't need to see, the music should strike me from that person. I really believe that somebody, if somebody really is a master of their craft, they are it. They can't but sing. Their words, even if they sing, is a music. That the person is poetic, I think. So for me, I think that that is, for me, the measure of somebody who's really good at what they do. And I think you've just demonstrated through this talk, where you've guided us through so many themes and highlighted and pointed out many of the themes within becoming a consultant, running consultancy, being a management consultant, but more importantly, those themes within organizations, businesses of all sizes, and the challenges and some of those themes to be mindful of in terms of the environment. And I love that that bit where you wrapped up, where you also highlighted quite shrewdly, but that by doing that, that's also going to be the thing that's going to help them spot the opportunities. And that, of course, is what business is also about. So I think I'm so glad that you brought that to our attention as well. So I just want to say a very, very big thank you from you.
Thank you very much for having me, and I'm looking forward to our series that we're going to start very soon.
Fantastic. Right, I'm going to press stop broadcast. So thanks everybody for tuning in. And of course, you'll find more of these talks either here on Rosario, I think it's on my Rasheed Ogunlaru, my YouTube channel, and remember there's a Soul Trader YouTube channel and so on. But I hope you enjoy these talks, the webinars, the talks, the podcasts, and all of the rest of it. Thank you so much for tuning in.